Picture this. You wake up in a freezing stone chamber. Your breath fogs in the air, your mattress stuffed with straw, and your only comfort is a pile of furs. At your feet, servants snore on the floor like loyal watchdogs. Across the land, a countess is forced into marriage at 12, expected to produce an heir by 13, and told to smile about it. And at the banquet table, a roasted peacock, redressed in its feathers, carried in not to be eaten, but to dazzle the guests. And you thought your office job was bad. Before we step into the glamorous misery of medieval nobility tonight, a quick note. If you'd like to listen to these stories without ads, offline, and with a bonus insider episode, you can find the ad-free collection linked in the description and pinned comment. Now humor me. Tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are right now? And yes, subscribe. Nobles had castles, tapestries, and family lineages to make them unforgettable. You have a button under this video. Tap it or vanish like a forgotten peasant. All right, get comfortable. It's time to trudge through the strange, dazzling, and exhausting world of medieval nobility. You wake up to the sound of nothing. No traffic outside, no hum of electricity, no muffled chatter from a neighbor's television. Just silence and the faint crackle of yesterday's fire dying in the hearth. You shift under the heavy layers of wool and fur that cover you and realize immediately that your nose is frozen. Your breath fogs in the air, hanging like little ghosts above your bed. Welcome to life as a medieval noble. This is not a luxury hotel, despite what the travel brochures of history might suggest. You're in a drafty Norman keep, a stone fortress that's as much a prison as it is a palace. The walls are thick enough to stop an army, but unfortunately, they're also perfect at trapping the cold. The windows? Arrow slits, barely wide enough to admit a shaft of light, and certainly not wide enough to bring in fresh air. Not that you'd want fresh air. Outside smells like smoke, dung, and the faint aroma of whatever the peasants were cooking 3 villages away. Let's talk about your bed. Yes, nobles had beds, and yes, they were larger than what most peasants slept on, which was nothing but straw on the floor, if they were lucky. Your mattress is technically stuffed with straw, too, but it's been padded over with layers of wool, down, and goose feathers. Curtains hang around it, heavy and lined with furs, to block out the worst of the drafts. A bed like this could be 7 feet long, designed so you and your spouse can sleep propped up, half sitting, rather than flat on your backs. Why? Because everyone in this period believed lying down completely was practically an invitation for death to come creeping in. Still, don't imagine this as cozy. The sheets are scratchy. The furs smell faintly of wet dog. And underneath all that, the straw has to be replaced constantly. Otherwise, the bed becomes a thriving hotel for lice and fleas. So yes, congratulations. You're one of the elite few who gets to sleep above the floor. But you're also sharing that privilege with an entire colony of medieval insects. Now look around the room. You'd think as a noble, you'd at least get privacy. Wrong. The very concept of personal space as you know it today simply doesn't exist here. Your spouse is, of course, beside you, not out of love, but because your marriage is a business contract between families. One of your children might be bundled into the corner, wrapped in wool, because noble children were often raised right alongside their parents until they were old enough to be shipped off as squires or ladies-in-waiting. And then there are the servants. Yes, your loyal attendants sleep on the floor, curled up in blankets or on simple mats, because their job is to be available at all hours. If you stir in the night and need a candle lit, a chamber pot emptied, or just someone to grumble at, they're there. Romantic? Sure. If your definition of romance includes freezing in fur-lined curtains while your servant snores at your feet. And let's not forget the smells. The chamber has a faint perfume of yesterday's embers, which never fully burned out. Mixed with that is the sharp tang of herbs strewn across the rushes on the floor. Lavender, mint, maybe rosemary. Not because nobles were obsessed with aromatherapy, but because herbs were one of the few tools available to combat lice, fleas, and the omnipresent stench of humanity. And yes, layered over all that is the aroma of unwashed bodies. Bathing was rare. Nobles might sponge themselves with a basin of cold water in the morning, but full immersion in a bath was something reserved for special occasions. So everyone smells, including you. It's still early. The sun hasn't climbed high enough to pierce through the narrow window slits. You hear the faint scuffle of movement. A servant stoking the fire, another preparing a basin of icy water for you to wash your face. You don't get the luxury of sleeping in. Your schedule isn't your own. It belongs to the endless rhythm of estate management, prayer, and duty. Take a moment to listen. Beyond the stone walls, the castle is already alive. Guards shift at their posts in the courtyard, their boots crunching in the frost. Horses stamp in the stables, impatient for feeding. Somewhere down in the kitchens, fires are being lit. The only place in the castle where warmth comes easily, though that warmth rarely makes its way up to you. The smell of smoke drifts upward, mingled with the faint scent of whatever coarse bread will be served for breakfast. You rise reluctantly from your heavy bed. The furs cling to you, their warmth already fading as the cold rushes in to take their place. A servant helps you dress. And yes, it's a process. Layer upon layer of linen and wool, tunic over shirt, hose and chausses, a belt to keep it all in place. Clothes here aren't just fabric. They're armor against the chill and, more importantly, armor for your reputation. Every visible stitch is a sign of wealth, each color a clue to your rank. This is the reality of noble life in the medieval world. Yes, you live in a castle. Yes, you eat better food than the peasants. Yes, you command soldiers and servants and have land that stretches farther than you can see. But your daily existence begins here, in a bed that's not as comfortable as it looks, in a room that smells faintly of smoke and sweat, surrounded by people you didn't choose. So much for luxury. And yet, compared to the peasants outside, freezing in one-room huts with livestock for company, you are unimaginably privileged. They'd give anything for a bed with curtains, for servants to stoke their fire, for food that wasn't a pot of watery gruel. You are, whether you like it or not, at the very top of the medieval pyramid, shivering, scratching, and snoring your way through the dawn. Now take another breath. Feel the cold seep into your bones. Hear the fire crackle low, the servants stir, the castle creak awake around you. This is where your noble day begins, not with glamour, but with goosebumps. You've dragged yourself out of bed, shaken the lice from your linens, and shoved your arms into a tunic. Before you stumble into the day, it's worth asking a simple question. Who exactly are you anyway? This label, noble, that people throw around, what does it mean? Is it just anyone with a big house and servants? Or does it actually come with rules? In medieval Europe, nobility was not just a fancy lifestyle brand. It was an entire system, locked tight like the gears of a clock. And at the very top of that clock, predictably, was the king, or in some cases the queen. The monarch was not just a political leader. They were the living embodiment of law, the ultimate landlord, the original boss who can't be fired. Everything and everyone else in the noble class flowed down from them, like a pyramid made of very cold, very ambitious human beings. Just under the monarchs sat the dukes and duchesses. Think of them as the CEOs of entire regions. They controlled massive swathes of land, sometimes larger than modern countries. Beneath them were counts and earls who managed slightly smaller territories, a kind of middle management of the noble world. Then came barons, who held more modest estates but still had the power to tax, to judge, and to fight. And finally, at the bottom of this glittering pile of privilege, were the knights. Now, knights weren't just armored movie stars riding off into the sunset. They were landholders too, sworn into loyalty with oaths that were supposed to bind them tighter than chains. A knight could be both a warrior and a landlord, both protector and tax collector. It was a dual identity, one part shining armor, one part ruthless accountant. This hierarchy wasn't just symbolic. It was brutally practical. Each noble owed something to the one above them. Land was granted in exchange for loyalty, and loyalty was usually measured in men and money. If your king needed an army, you, as a noble, had to show up, not just with yourself, but with horses, armor, provisions, and a small crowd of peasants you'd hastily train to hold pointy sticks. In return, you got to keep your land, collect taxes, and remind everyone else that you were a very important person. And what exactly did collecting taxes mean? Well, it didn't mean sending a polite email reminder to your tenants. It meant demanding grain, livestock, labor, and coin from the peasants on your estates. You took the lion's share, sent a polite cut upward to the monarch, and kept the rest. Basically, you got rich by controlling the people who actually did the work. Or, to put it bluntly, the noble class was a pyramid scheme with swords. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of the De Vere family, one of England's great noble houses. If you've ever wondered how a family could stay rich and important for centuries, here's your case study. It all begins with a man named Aubrey de Vere, who crossed the English Channel in 1066 with William the Conqueror. Aubrey wasn't just another knight in the crowd. He was close enough to the king to be given the title of Chamberlain, which meant he managed royal documents, charters, and the king's personal business. Imagine the trust involved. If William wanted to sign away land, Aubrey's name might be right there at the bottom, as a witness. That kind of closeness to power was worth its weight in gold, or in this case, worth its weight in acres. For his loyalty, and for helping William stab a lot of Anglo-Saxons into submission, Aubrey was rewarded with land. Not a farm, not a manor, but vast holdings scattered across multiple counties. By the time the records were tallied in the Domesday Book, the De Veres were already lords of estates so large that you could walk for days and still be on their land. Essex, Oxfordshire, and beyond, the De Vere name was stamped into the soil of England. And what did that land mean? It meant peasants, hundreds, even thousands of families who owed their rent, their labor, and their obedience to Aubrey and his heirs. It meant wealth pouring in from grain harvests, sheep's wool, fishing rights, and tolls on roads. It meant castles rising out of the earth as physical reminders of who was in charge. The De Vere climbed higher with each generation. By the 1100s, Aubrey's grandson had been granted the title Earl of Oxford. Earldoms were among the highest noble titles in England, putting the De Vere just a few handshakes away from the throne itself. They were no longer just servants of the king. They were kingmakers. Their voice mattered in Parliament. Their soldiers mattered in war. And their name carried the weight of centuries. And if you're wondering whether this privilege was ever in doubt, the answer is rarely. Unlike peasants, who could lose everything after one bad harvest, the De Veres were practically untouchable. Noble lineage had a way of preserving itself, no matter how reckless or violent the individuals in the family might be. Marriages cemented alliances. Titles passed from father to son, generation after generation. Even when one Aubrey de Vere was murdered by a mob in London, the family itself didn't collapse. They buried him in their monastery, prayed for his soul, and continued the business of ruling. This is the power of nobility in the medieval world. It wasn't just about individual wealth or comfort. It was about being part of a class that held the monopoly on violence, land, and law. Nobles didn't just live in castles. They were castles, fortified by networks of kinship, marriage, and royal favor. So yes, when you hear the word noble, don't imagine a gentle knight helping peasants cross streams. Imagine a man whose ancestors got rich by helping William the Conqueror stab everyone in 1066, and who spent the next 4 centuries collecting rent, commanding armies, and occasionally hosting banquets where swans were roasted just to impress the neighbors. It wasn't fair, it wasn't equal, and it wasn't particularly glamorous when you're freezing in your stone keep. But it worked. Nobility was the backbone of medieval Europe, not because they were wise or noble in character, but because they were rich, ruthless, and very good at surviving. And you, as you stand here adjusting your woolen sleeves, you're part of it now. Congratulations, you're a medieval noble, an overworked landlord in a fur coat, balancing loyalty to your king with the demands of the peasants who resent you. Sleep on that thought. Step outside your chamber now. The cold stone under your feet is not welcoming, but then again, castles were never built to be comfortable. They were built to remind everyone who looked at them that you are important, dangerous, and very much in charge. At its heart, your home is a motte and bailey. That's not just an architectural term. It's basically medieval code for a really inconvenient fortress plonked in the middle of farmland. Picture it. The motte, a raised mound of earth, often artificial, with a wooden or stone keep planted right on top like a cherry on a sundae. At the bottom, sprawled out like an afterthought, is the bailey, a courtyard enclosed by wooden palisades or stone walls. It's where the stables, kitchens, workshops, and sometimes even peasants' huts are crammed together. Practical, yes. Glamorous? Not unless you're especially fond of the smell of horse manure wafting up to your windows. Of course, the most intimidating part isn't what's inside, but what it looks like from the outside. A proper castle is essentially a billboard carved in stone, a giant message to every peasant, traveler, and enemy army in sight that says, "This land belongs to me." Also, good luck trying to take it. The walls are high, the towers imposing, and the drawbridge creaks like a set piece in a bad horror movie. Moats? Yes, sometimes. But before you imagine a romantic, water-filled trench with swans gliding across it, remember that most moats were little more than muddy ditches filled with stagnant water, trash, and the occasional unfortunate animal that wandered in. Still, they did the job. Nothing screams keep out like a trench of suspiciously bubbling liquid circling your home. Step inside and notice the design. Every stairwell is narrow, spiraling clockwise. Why? because the defenders running down the stairs could swing their swords with their right hand freely, while the attackers coming up would have their arms pressed awkwardly against the wall. Clever. The arrow slits? Just wide enough for a bowman to aim down at invaders, but miserably narrow if you're hoping for sunlight. And don't get too attached to fresh air. These castles were less about your respiratory health and more about making sure enemy soldiers couldn't climb inside. Yet here's the contradiction. Downstairs, your keep is all business. Dark, damp, defensive. Upstairs, it's trying desperately to impress. Your hall is hung with tapestries, not just to brighten things up, but to insulate against the cold and to disguise the fact that without them, the walls are essentially giant stone refrigerators. You'll have plaster painted in bright reds, yellows, and blues, because medieval taste leaned toward the gaudy rather than the subtle. Every noble wanted guests to walk in and immediately think, yes, these people are rich and maybe a little tasteless. Still, for all the effort put into decoration, don't forget what the building is whispering underneath. To the peasants trudging across your fields, this castle is not a cozy family home. It's a daily reminder of their place in the order of things. Every time they look up from plowing, there it is, looming over them, a monument in stone that declares, peasants couldn't look at the horizon without being reminded that some knight owned their rent, their crops, and probably their teeth. And here's the thing. Castles didn't just dominate the landscape physically, they dominated it psychologically. Imagine being a peasant walking 10 miles to market, and no matter where you stood, you could see the outline of a lord's keep on the skyline. It's like a medieval version of a corporate logo, constant branding, etched into the countryside. You are here, and you are owned. Yet, for all the intimidation factor, living in one wasn't as glamorous as the outside suggested. Stone walls sweat moisture. Fires filled the air with smoke. Rooms were often dark and cramped. Privacy was non-existent. Even your private solar or upper chamber might be shared with servants, guards, and members of your household. A castle was safer than a hut, yes, but it was also colder, noisier, and often lonelier. Now stand at the gate and look down. Notice how the drawbridge funnels visitors into one tight space. That's deliberate. Anyone coming to see you has to pass through layers of intimidation. Guards, gates, portcullises, maybe even a murder hole above their head from which hot oil, rocks, or boiling water could be dropped. By the time they reach your hall, they've already been softened up by the architecture itself. The building has convinced them, long before you speak, that you're powerful. It's important to remember, too, that castles weren't built for fun. They were built because people were constantly fighting. Local rivalries, border wars, rebellions, all of it made stone walls necessary. Castles were prisons in reverse. Instead of locking criminals in, they locked armies out. Or at least, they tried. Sieges were common, and a castle could quickly transform from a seat of luxury into a stone trap where you and your household were slowly starved into submission. So yes, your home is a symbol of dominance, but it's also a cage. You might feel grand looking out from your battlements, but when an enemy army surrounds you, the same walls that once made you proud now hold you captive. Imagine weeks of dwindling food, smoke choking the halls, rats running across the floors, and all the while, your peasants outside, watching with grim satisfaction as their noble protector discovers what it really means to be trapped. This was the paradox of noble life. You lived in a fortress that both secured and confined you. A monument that declared your wealth while draining it because castles were outrageously expensive to build and maintain. Just repairing walls or replacing timber could cost a fortune, one that only endless streams of peasant taxes could cover. So the next time someone romanticizes medieval castles, picture it properly. Yes, they're dramatic silhouettes against the sky. Yes, they were feats of engineering. But inside, they were cold, smoky, uncomfortable, and expensive. And for the people outside, they were constant reminders of a social order that said, "You work, they rule." Congratulations, noble listener. Your home is impressive, terrifying, and faintly miserable, just like you. And if you don't subscribe, well, centuries from now, no one will even remember you. Nobles carved their names into castles. All you have is a button. Press it or vanish like a forgotten peasant. The castle is awake now. You hear it before you feel it. The clatter of wooden buckets from the kitchens, the dull thud of boots on stone, the faint groan of gates opening for the day's business. Your servants move quietly, which is their way of pretending you are still asleep. But you know better. You've never really been allowed to sleep in. Not as a noble. The first indignity of your day comes in the form of a basin. A servant places it on a small table near your bed, and the water inside is ice cold. This isn't a luxury spa moment. It's a bowl of freezing liquid fetched from a well before dawn. You splash it on your face, gasping a little at the shock. The purpose is not cleanliness in the way you might understand it, but ritual. A quick wash of hands and face to make you feel slightly more human and to prove you've started the day in a state of order. Baths? Forget it. A full-body immersion in water is a rare occasion, a luxury for feast days, weddings, or when disease has frightened everyone into thinking dirt is sinful. The rest of the time, you smell faintly of smoke, sweat, and whatever herbs your servants scatter across the floor in a valiant attempt at deodorizing. Next comes the business of dressing. Clothes are not just protection against the cold. They are your identity stitched together in wool and linen. A servant pulls a fresh linen shirt over your head. It's plain but white, which matters, because peasants can't afford linen at all. Over that goes a woolen tunic, dyed in colors that peasants would envy. Dyes are expensive. The brighter the fabric, the more you're bragging. Slip on some hose and chausses, cinch it all with a belt, and suddenly you're not just a cold, shivering human anymore. You're a noble, wrapped in authority and stitched into the social order. If you're important enough, you might add a surcoat or cloak, trimmed with fur to really drive the point home. Your servants know their place. They button and tie, fuss with folds, and stand back when you check the drape of your sleeve. Clothes aren't optional here. They're the uniform of power. One misplaced button, one cheap fabric, and your reputation is in tatters faster than your tunic. And now, food. Don't expect a banquet. Breakfast for a medieval noble is not the lavish feast you imagine from television dramas. Instead, it's a table with bread that might be a little stale, a jug of weak ale, and maybe a slice of yesterday's meat if the servants were thoughtful. Eggs or cheese if you're lucky. Spices, honey, or fresh fruit if you're really trying to impress a guest. You take a bite of bread, chew slowly, and try to ignore the fact that it has the texture of wood. A swallow of ale washes it down. Congratulations, you've eaten yesterday's meat with today's bread. Luxury. Peasants, of course, would envy you. Their breakfast is often just pottage, a kind of gray vegetable soup, that tastes like resignation. You, at least, get wheat bread rather than rye or barley. And while peasants drink ale because the water isn't safe, you drink ale because, frankly, it tastes better. Weak, frothy, and more filling than water ever could. While you eat, the rhythm of the day begins to assert itself. A priest mutters morning prayers in the chapel. Bells echo faintly through the halls. A steward hovers nearby, waiting to whisper the estate business of the day. There are disputes to settle, rents to collect, perhaps even guests arriving who must be impressed before they can make demands. This is the part of noble life that isn't glamorous but unavoidable, the daily grind of management. You don't just sit in your castle eating peacocks. You oversee an economy. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of peasants depend on your decisions about when to plant, how to tax, and what punishments to hand out when someone steals firewood. Every log, every sheep, every strip of land is under your control, and by extension, your responsibility. As you nibble the last of your bread, you consider the rhythm of the day ahead. There will be prayers, of course, because you're supposed to keep God on your side. Meals will divide your time. Midday dinner as the main event. Supper later, if supplies allow. Between them, you'll hold court, inspect your estate, maybe even practice some sword play to keep up appearances as a warrior. And if you're particularly unlucky, you'll sit through endless discussions about taxes, marriages, and minor disputes over boundary stones. Your servants clear the table. The chamber pot is discreetly removed, the hearth is restoked, and already the keep is buzzing louder. Outside, peasants are trudging to fields you'll probably never touch with your own hands, though their labor funds your bread and your ale. Inside, your steward begins reading out the list of grievances from the village. And you rub your eyes, adjust your cloak, and prepare to play the part that was written for you centuries before you were born. This is mourning for a medieval noble. Not glamorous, not lazy, but a strict routine of washing, dressing, praying, and managing. It is privilege wrapped in obligation, comfort built on other people's work. And as you sip the last of your ale, you realize something. Your life isn't entirely your own. It belongs to the rhythm of the castle, the demands of the estate, and the expectations of everyone who looks at you and sees more than just a human in wool. You are the system, and your day has only just begun. You descend the narrow stone stairs, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and last night's embers, and find yourself in the heart of your castle, the Great Hall. This is the room that makes or breaks your reputation. Forget the cold, forget the drafty chambers upstairs. The hall is where you display your power, stage your generosity, and remind everyone who visits exactly why you own the land and they don't. The first thing you notice isn't the gloom of bare stone walls, because they aren't bare. The hall is plastered over and painted in bold colors: reds, yellows, deep blues. Geometric patterns sprawl across the surfaces. On the walls hang great tapestries, depicting hunting scenes, biblical stories, and sometimes just elaborate patterns meant to prove you could afford to hire the best weavers. These tapestries don't only show off, they also work as insulation, keeping the hall marginally warmer and muffling echoes. Without them, the room would be nothing but a stone box with terrible acoustics. A massive hearth burns at the center or along one wall, smoke curling up into the rafters before finding its way out through a hole or rudimentary chimney. The firelight flickers over long trestle tables arranged for meals, and at the far end, a raised dais where you, the noble, sit in your high-backed chair. From this perch, you look down on everyone else. It's architecture designed to remind people of hierarchy. Guests sit by rank, closest to you if they're important, further away if they're not. Servants scuttle at the edges, topping up mugs and clearing trenchers. And what's for dinner? More than peasants will ever see in a year. The centerpiece is venison, freshly carved from the deer your huntsman brought in. There are boars roasted whole, hares stewed with herbs, and platters of fish carted in from distant rivers. Bread is white, not the coarse rye or barley that peasants choke down, but fine wheat flour, sifted and kneaded into soft loaves that only wealth can buy. Spices, too, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, all imported from trade routes that stretch halfway across the known world. Each pinch costs more than most peasants earn in a month, but you sprinkle it anyway, because you can. And of course, the drink. Ale is common, yes, but if you want to make a statement, you serve wine. Imported from Gascony, Burgundy, or even farther afield, wine is a mark of taste, wealth, and connection. It flows red into silver goblets, and everyone notices. Ale, meanwhile, is the default drink, safer than water, filling, but nothing to boast about. So when you sip your spiced wine while a guest nurses plain ale, the message is clear. Your status is measured not just by what you eat, but by what you wash it down with. But don't imagine this hall is only for feasting. It's also your courtroom, your stage for dispensing justice. Peasants shuffle in, hats in hand, to complain about stolen sheep, broken fences, or neighbors who cut wood without permission. You sit in judgment, swathed in furs, listening with one ear as servants bring you steaming dishes, and with a straight face, you declare verdicts, fines, punishments, restitution. Because nothing says justice like a man in furs judging a peasant's theft of firewood while sipping spiced wine. There's politics here, too. Deals are struck across the table, marriages arranged, alliances cemented over meat and drink. A smile at the right guest, a gift of food at the right moment could mean the difference between loyalty and rebellion. You don't just eat in the hall, you perform in it. Every bite, every sip, every gesture is watched and interpreted. Even how long you let someone sit at your table says something about their worth. And then there's entertainment. After the trenchers are cleared and the bones scraped away by hounds at your feet, the hall fills with music. Minstrels pluck lutes, harps, or fiddles. Poets recite ballads of kings, saints, and legendary heroes. Sometimes jesters appear, juggling knives or telling jokes that skirt dangerously close to insulting their audience. Laughter echoes through the rafters. The smell of food lingers in the air. And for a few hours, the castle feels less like a fortress and more like a stage. But don't be fooled. Beneath all the color, all the laughter, all the noise, the hall is still a weapon. It's designed to impress, to intimidate, to reinforce your power. The peasants who file in to beg for mercy see the tapestries, the fire, the rich foods, and they know, without a word, that they'll never sit at this table. The visiting knight sees the rank of your guests and understands exactly where he stands in the pecking order. And you? You play the role of magnanimous lord, even as you calculate taxes, rents, and favors owed. Now step back for a moment and look around this hall. The firelight dances, the goblets gleam, the servants hurry, and you sit above it all. It feels permanent, eternal, a little slice of order carved out of a chaotic world. Yet you know better. You know that this room is as much theater as it is reality. The walls are stone, yes, but the system that props you up is fragile. Without peasants to work the land, without knights to fight your battles, without trade to bring spices and wine, all of this grandeur collapses into silence. For now, though, the hall is alive. The food is plentiful, the fire roars, the guests flatter you with their smiles. The great hall is where you are most noble, most visible, most powerful. It is the beating heart of your castle, equal parts dining room, courtroom, and stage. And tomorrow, it will all happen again. Bread, venison, wine, complaints, judgments, music. The performance never ends. You weren't born noble just to lounge in a castle eating venison. No, your family expects you to become a finely tuned instrument of power, whether that means wielding a sword, running a household, or marrying into a better alliance. From the moment you can walk without tripping over your tunic, your training begins. If you're a boy, your path is laid out like a medieval career ladder. First rung, the page. Around the age of 7, you're packed off to another noble household. Why not stay with your parents? Because they don't want you underfoot, and because being a page is as much about networking as it is about education. You'll fetch wine for your lord, carry messages, and learn how to be useful without making too much noise. You'll also start lessons in horsemanship, swordplay, and perhaps even literacy, though don't get your hopes up for a library. At this stage, your main job is to watch and absorb. You study how nobles eat, how they talk, how they pray. You learn how to dress a knight in armor, how to serve at table, and most importantly, how to keep your mouth shut when someone important is speaking. Think of it as a decade-long internship, but with more mud and less coffee. Once you've proven yourself as a page, usually in your teens, you graduate to the second rung, the squire. This is where the real training begins. You're assigned to a knight, and your job is to be his personal assistant, bodyguard in training, and general dog's body. You clean his armor, sharpen his weapons, and tend to his horse. You also follow him into battle, not as a frontline fighter, but as the guy who drags him out if he falls. It's a tough gig, and many squires discovered the hard way that war was not a glamorous adventure, but a muddy, bloody business. But if you survive your squire years without losing too many limbs, you might finally be dubbed a knight. The ceremony itself is dripping with symbolism, baths for purification, a night-long vigil in the chapel, and the moment of knighthood where you kneel before your lord and receive a symbolic blow, the dubbing. It's meant to remind you that if you flinch, you don't deserve the title. Romantic? Perhaps. Terrifying? Definitely. And then comes the code of chivalry. You've probably heard of it. Honor, loyalty, protecting the weak, serving God. Lovely ideas. In practice, chivalry meant being polite to your fellow nobles while trampling peasants into the dirt. Protecting the weak? Sure. If the weak person in question happened to be related to someone important. Otherwise, not so much. Let's be honest. Chivalry was less about moral integrity and more about making warfare look like a gentleman's pastime. Or, to put it another way, chivalry was the art of trampling peasants politely while charging rent. If you're a girl, your training looks different, but it's no less demanding. You're taught to manage a household from the time you can hold a needle. Sewing, weaving, and embroidery are not just hobbies. They're essential skills for running a noble estate. You'll learn how to supervise servants, keep food stores accounted for, and make sure your husband's clothes don't fall apart in public. You'll also practice reading and writing, especially if your family is ambitious. A literate noblewoman can handle correspondence and accounts, which makes her invaluable. But don't mistake this for independence. Your future has already been plotted. By your teens, you'll be married off to cement an alliance, expand land holdings, or secure peace between families. Your dowry, the wealth you bring to the marriage, matters more than your personality. And your primary duty, once wed, is to produce heirs. Girls were groomed not for battlefields, but for negotiation tables and childbirth. And just like boys, they were expected to uphold family honor, only with fewer swords and more embroidery hoops. Training didn't stop at childhood either. Nobles were constantly drilled in their roles. Men practiced jousting, hunting, and the management of vassals. Women practiced diplomacy, piety, and the subtle art of keeping households and alliances from falling apart. Everyone, regardless of gender, was reminded daily that they weren't just individuals. They were extensions of their family name, walking advertisements for their lineage. This relentless training ensured one thing: nobles stayed nobles. You didn't just inherit a title, you were molded into it. Pages learned obedience, squires learned endurance, knights learned spectacle. Girls learned management, restraint, and strategy. And together, they kept the entire system running. A delicate balance of swords, marriages, and well-placed prayers. Of course, the reality was never as perfect as the theory. Not every knight was gallant. Many were thugs in armor. Not every lady was submissive. Some wielded power with more authority than their husbands. But the training ensured that, on the surface, nobility looked orderly, disciplined, and civilized. That was the performance. Beneath it, they were as flawed, ambitious, and petty as anyone else. So when you think of medieval nobility, don't picture a fairy tale prince or a gracious lady. Picture a boy polishing someone else's sword while dreaming of his own coat of arms. Picture a girl embroidering her family's crest while waiting to be married off like a parcel. And picture the endless rehearsals that turned children into nobles, whether they liked it or not. So, you've woken up, splashed icy water on your face, put on your expensive wool tunic, and eaten bread so stale it could double as masonry. Now comes the real part of noble life: work. Not work in the sense of plowing fields or mucking stables, heaven forbid, but work in the sense of managing the people who actually do those things. Step outside into the courtyard. The chill is still clinging to the stones, but the place is alive. Servants are already hauling firewood, squires are wrestling with horses, and messengers are waiting to shove letters into your hands. And all eyes turn toward you, because whether you like it or not, you are the lord of this domain. Your first duty is land. Look around you, fields stretching into the distance, dotted with huts and smoke from peasant hearths. These farms are the lifeblood of your wealth. Every furrow plowed, every sheep shorn, every barrel of ale brewed is ultimately tied to your prosperity. And while you don't get your hands dirty, you do make decisions about crop rotations, rents, and tithes. You appoint bailiffs to keep track of it all, and stewards to oversee the finer details. But the responsibility rests on your fur-clad shoulders. If the harvest fails, the peasants starve, and your income vanishes with them. Then there are the forests. They aren't just pretty scenery. They're carefully managed resources: wood for building, hunting grounds for sport, and sometimes jealously guarded royal preserves. Poaching deer from your forest is one of the worst crimes a peasant can commit, and you will happily enforce that law, because venison is your dinner, not theirs. Next comes the village. every peasant family pays you rent, in coin, grain, or labor. Some owe days of unpaid work on your land, which you graciously call feudal obligations. They may think it unfair, but from your perspective, it's the natural order of things. You provide protection, at least theoretically, and in return, they keep your hall filled with bread and meat. It's not exactly a balanced deal, but who said medieval life was fair? And then there are the courts. Yes, lords were also judges. Picture it, peasants shuffling into your hall, caps in hand to present their complaints. A cow wandered across a boundary. A fence was broken. Firewood stolen. It's up to you to decide who's guilty and what the punishment should be. Sometimes it's a fine, sometimes labor, sometimes a beating. All while you sit wrapped in fur, sipping wine, trying not to look bored. Because nothing says justice like a man in furs judging a peasant's theft of firewood while sipping spiced wine. But don't think this is just a 9 to 5. Your duties extend upward as well. Above you is the crown, and the king expects loyalty and troops. When the royal summons comes, you're obligated to send knights and men-at-arms, often at your own expense. You might even have to lead them yourself, riding off to war while your steward tries to keep the estate running in your absence. It's expensive, dangerous, and deeply inconvenient. But it's also the price of holding land. Nobility is not just privilege. It's a contract sealed in taxes, soldiers, and blood. Of course, managing all this requires help. You're not actually tallying grain stores or interrogating peasants about broken hedges. That's why you have stewards, reeves, and bailiffs. They handle the daily grind while you loom in the background as the ultimate authority. Think of it as being an executive in a very grim corporation. You don't process the paperwork yourself, but your signature is the one that decides whether someone keeps their land or loses it. And the peasants? They may resent you, but they also depend on you. When raiders sweep across the countryside, it's your castle they flee to. When famine strikes, it's your granaries they beg for. When justice is needed, or at least a version of it, it's your court they stand before. You are landlord, protector, and judge all at once. Basically, HR manager, tax collector, and local warlord rolled into one. But here's the uncomfortable truth. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. For all the privilege and ceremony, your daily life is filled with endless complaints, disputes, and responsibilities. One moment you're hearing a case about stolen chickens. The next, you're reviewing military musters. The next, you're arguing with your steward about how much grain to send to the abbey. It's an endless carousel of minor crises, punctuated by the occasional banquet or hunt. And yet, for all the drudgery, the system works. For you, anyway. The peasants labor, the stewards manage, the crown rules, and you, lodged firmly in the middle, reap the benefits. You are indispensable to the order of things. Remove the noble, and the whole feudal pyramid wobbles. At least, that's what you tell yourself when you're sitting through another tedious court session about boundary stones. So, as you step back into your great hall, draped in tapestries and warmed by fire, remember that beneath the glamour, your real job is paperwork, judgment, and occasional violence. Nobility is not a license for laziness. It's a full-time occupation in power management, and the peasants aren't going to remind themselves who's in charge. This is your role: landholder, judge, manager, soldier. The glue between king and peasant. The one person who stands at the center of an entire system built on obedience, taxes, and force. And while you may sigh at the weight of it all, you also know one thing. No matter how much you complain, you'd never trade places with the people who actually till the soil. Because in the end, you're not just any noble. You are the Lord. And that means the system works for you. But here's the catch. Unlike medieval lords, you don't have tapestries or castles to make sure you're remembered. You've only got a little red button under this video. Tap it, or fade into history like one more forgotten peasant. Let's turn from the Lord to the lady. Because while he's out there pretending to be the glue that holds the kingdom together, she's the one making sure the castle doesn't collapse into chaos. If the medieval nobleman was the face of power, the noblewoman was the backbone. Invisible most of the time, but essential all of the time. You, noblewoman, are the CEO of this household. Forget embroidery samplers and fainting couches. That image belongs to later centuries. In the Middle Ages, your role is vast. You oversee the kitchens, storerooms, and textiles. You supervise a staff of servants whose loyalty is as essential as their labor. You keep the keys, literally. A lady's belt often jingled with keys to pantries, armories, and cellars, symbols of her authority over the day-to-day survival of everyone inside these walls. Start in the kitchens. Feeding hundreds of mouths is no small task, and though you aren't personally stirring the cauldrons, you're responsible for making sure the supplies exist. You know how many barrels of grain are stored, how much salt has been set aside for the winter, and whether the wine cellars are full enough to keep the hall lively through the cold months. If a feast is planned, you supervise the butchers, bakers, and brewers. A mistake here doesn't just mean a ruined dinner, it means humiliation in front of every guest who matters. Then move to textiles. Cloth is wealth in this world. You supervise the spinning of wool, the weaving of linen, the sewing of garments, and the endless mending required to keep everyone dressed. Embroidery isn't just decoration, it's a political tool. Tapestries display lineage and achievements, while clothes themselves shout rank in every stitch. A noblewoman who runs her household well ensures her family looks the part at all times. And then there are the servants. A castle is a machine that runs on human effort. And you, as its lady, are the one who keeps the gears turning. Maids to scrub floors, pages to run errands, grooms to handle horses, cooks to feed them all. Every one of them ultimately answers to you. You need discipline, delegation, and the ability to remind them that slacking off in your service is not an option. Modern managers might complain about unruly staff. You have to wrangle a small army with no HR department to back you up. But your responsibilities don't stop at bread and laundry. When your husband rides off to war or is summoned to the king's court, you don't just wave handkerchiefs from the window. You run the estate in his absence. You hold courts, resolve disputes, sign documents, and sometimes even command defenses if raiders appear. It's one thing to oversee the pantry. It's another to order men-at-arms onto the walls and organize patrols in the fields. And yes, many noble women did exactly that. Some women went further still. As widows or regents for underage heirs, they wielded extraordinary authority. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, not just a duchess, but queen of both France and England at different times. Or Matilda of Tuscany, who commanded armies and defied emperors. These weren't exceptions born of romance novels. They were practical outcomes of a system that often left women in charge by necessity. Behind every incompetent knight was a woman keeping the place from burning down. That said, don't mistake authority for freedom. Your life as a noblewoman is still defined by expectation. Your primary duty is to secure alliances through marriage and produce heirs. You may manage estates with skill, outwit rivals in court, or even defend a castle under siege. But the chroniclers rarely give you credit. They record the victories of your husband and sons, while your work is quietly absorbed into the smooth running of the household. Still, your influence is undeniable. You arrange marriages for your children, forging the alliances that keep your family's power alive. You gift tapestries and fine cloth to allies, strengthening bonds. You act as the visible model of piety, ensuring your family's reputation with the church, and you serve as the keeper of continuity, holding everything together through wars, deaths, and political upheaval. So imagine yourself in this role. You walk through the castle with keys jingling at your belt. Servants scurry to obey, pages bow their heads. The steward brings you accounts to review, the bailiff reports on the harvest, and the chaplain asks about donations to the local monastery. Everyone wants your decision, your approval, your command. Is it glamorous? Not exactly. You don't sit on thrones issuing royal edicts. You sit at tables balancing ledgers, inspecting cloth, and reminding the cook that undercooked venison at tonight's feast is not an option. But make no mistake, the survival of your household depends on you. Without your steady management, the Lord would return from war to find a castle in ruins and a staff in rebellion. This is the paradox of noble women in the medieval world. Officially, they are secondary: wives, mothers, daughters. In practice, they are essential: managers, diplomats, and when necessary, defenders. The chroniclers may have ignored them, but the castles would have crumbled without them. So while your husband rides off to prove his honor in battle, you keep the home intact, the accounts balanced, and the fires burning. And though the songs may never sing your name, history quietly admits you were the reason the whole structure held together. You've managed your land, judged your peasants, and endured another meal of bread stiff enough to patch a roof. Now comes the other great duty of your noble life, making sure your soul isn't completely doomed. Because here's the thing. As a noble, your daily routine is steeped in violence, greed, and the constant exploitation of other people's labor. You tax peasants into poverty. You send men to fight and die in your wars. You execute criminals in your court, often with more enthusiasm than fairness. And you do all of this while wrapped in fine wool and sipping imported wine. Deep down, you know this can't possibly look good on Judgment Day. Enter religion, your medieval insurance policy. Step into the chapel tucked inside your castle walls. It's not the soaring cathedral of a great city, but a private space built for you and your household. The air smells of beeswax and incense, a faint reprieve from the smoke and sweat of the hall. Stained glass filters what little light enters, casting jewel-toned shadows across the cold floor. A priest murmurs prayers in Latin, words you may not fully understand, but nod along to anyway. The important thing isn't comprehension, it's participation. Your day, like everyone else's in medieval Europe, is structured around the canonical hours. Matins in the night, lauds at dawn, prime in the morning, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Monks may keep to this schedule obsessively, but you, as a noble, use it to frame your day. Morning prayers before state business, midday prayers before dinner, evening prayers to wrap up the cycle. It's a rhythm designed to keep God ever present in your thoughts, even when your thoughts are mostly about rents, hunting, and who insulted you at last week's feast. But private prayers only go so far. You need something bigger, something that guarantees heavenly favor despite your less than holy lifestyle. That's where monasteries come in. Founding or funding a religious house is the medieval equivalent of buying indulgent insurance. Kill now, repent later. Just endow a monastery and you're golden. You donate land, wealth, or patronage to a community of monks or nuns. In return, they dedicate themselves to praying for your soul and the souls of your family. Not just today, not just tomorrow, but forever. Well, at least until the monastery runs out of money or is sacked by angry peasants. The idea is simple. You outsource your spiritual labor. While you're busy hunting deer or leading soldiers, a team of professionals is on retainer to make sure God hears your name in prayer several times a day. Many nobles took this very seriously. Look at the De Vere family, those long-standing earls of Oxford. They funded Colne Priory in Essex, ensuring that generations of monks would spend their lives chanting for the salvation of the De Vere souls. Aubrey de Vere II, for example, was killed by a London mob in 1141. It didn't matter. His body was carried back to the priory, laid to rest, and his soul placed under the perpetual care of chanting monks. That's the dream. No matter how messy your end, your eternal reputation is safe. Of course, religious devotion isn't just about the afterlife. It's also about appearances. Piety is another form of currency in medieval society. A noble who funds churches, chapels, or monasteries is seen as righteous and respectable. It softens the image of a man who might otherwise be remembered as a tax-hungry warlord. By kneeling in your private chapel, attending Mass, and sponsoring candles to burn on feast days, you remind everyone that you're not just powerful, you're holy. And don't underestimate the politics of piety. The church is not a background institution in this world. It's a dominant force. Bishops wield power like barons. Abbots run estates as large as counties. Aligning yourself with the church means securing allies who can bless your conquests, support your heirs, or at the very least, refrain from excommunicating you. Nothing ruins a noble's career faster than being cut off from the sacraments. So, as you kneel on the cold floor of your chapel, consider the balancing act. On one hand, you are a warrior, landlord, and judge, roles that demand harshness and violence. On the other hand, you are expected to embody Christian virtue, humility, and charity. It's a contradiction baked into noble life. The solution? You lean heavily on ritual, prayer, and the comforting thought that somewhere, in some monastery you funded, monks are praying hard enough to cancel out your sins. It's not entirely cynical either. Many nobles were genuinely devout. They built chapels not just as tokens of piety, but because they wanted God present in their daily lives. They endowed monasteries not just for salvation, but to leave behind legacies that outlasted their fragile, often violent lives. Faith, fear, and pragmatism blended into a single unbreakable habit. Pray, donate, repeat. So your day continues. You leave the chapel, cross yourself, and step back into the business of lords and ladies. Behind you, the priest continues to mutter prayers you half understood. In some abbey miles away, monks chant your family's name in solemn tones. And you feel just a little lighter, a little more assured that all your sins, the extortion, the violence, the excess, are being steadily counterbalanced. Because if there's one thing medieval nobility excelled at, it was turning religion into a form of insurance. Eternal life guaranteed. Terms and conditions may apply. Love, that's a nice fairy tale. But if you're a medieval noble, love has nothing to do with it. Your marriage isn't a romance. It's a business deal with a side of piety. Your vows might as well say, I take thee as part of a property merger. From the moment you're born, your future is already penciled in. You are a pawn in your family's grand strategy, and your marriage is the bargaining chip. If you're a boy, your parents are eyeing which heiress can expand your estate. If you're a girl, your family is calculating how large a dowry they can afford to offer or demand. Forget starry-eyed proposals. The only stars involved here are on your family's heraldry. Children are often betrothed before they even know what betrothal means. At 7, you might already be promised to the son or daughter of a neighboring noble. Contracts are drawn up, sealed with wax, and everyone nods solemnly, pretending that the union is for peace, when really it's about land, soldiers, and who controls which forest. By the time you're a teenager, you're shipped off to your new household with little say in the matter. And if you're a noblewoman, your value is measured less in personality and more in assets. Land, gold, political connections, these are the currencies of your marriage market. You bring a dowry, and in exchange, your husband's family gains wealth and influence. Once the vows are spoken, your duty becomes crystal clear. Produce heirs, preferably sons. Your womb is a political factory, and the family legacy depends on it. That doesn't mean men are free from pressure. If you're a nobleman, your family expects you to maintain the alliance, protect the land that came with it, and make sure your wife delivers legitimate heirs. Your reputation rests not just on your own shoulders, but on hers as well. If she fails, it reflects on you. If you fail, it reflects on your entire lineage. No pressure. So what does a noble wedding actually look like? Picture the scene. A chapel filled with flickering candles. A priest murmuring vows in Latin. 2 nervous teenagers, or sometimes one teenager and a much older spouse, standing stiffly at the altar. Around them, families beam, not because they see young love, but because they see a contract fulfilled. The kiss that seals the marriage is less about romance and more about finalizing the merger. Congratulations. You're now bound for life to someone chosen for you, whether you like them or not. And yet, despite the cynicism, marriages weren't always miserable. Affection sometimes grew over time. Couples laughed together, shared hardships, and even carved out companionship within the rigid structure. But it was never guaranteed, never the point. Love was a bonus, not the foundation. Your children, meanwhile, aren't just your offspring. They're investments. Sons are groomed to inherit titles and lands, continuing the family's power. Daughters are raised with needlework and prayers, destined to be married off in the next round of alliances. Even before they can walk, you're already plotting their futures. Who will marry whom, which alliances will strengthen your house, and which rival families must be tied to yours by blood. This obsession with lineage explains why nobles kept such meticulous genealogies. Coats of arms, heraldic symbols, elaborate family trees, all of it shouted to the world, we've been important for generations, and we plan to keep it that way. Of course, not every arrangement worked out. Families shifted allegiances, wars broke contracts, spouses grew resentful, but divorce wasn't an option. At best, you could beg the church for an annulment on the grounds of some obscure rule about distant kinship. More often than not, though, you were stuck. A lifetime bound to the politics of your marriage, whether you liked it or not. So as you sit at the high table, your spouse beside you, children arranged in neat rows like pawns in a chess match, remember what this is really about. Every smile is strategy. Every child is a political asset. Every vow you took at the altar was less about "till death do us part" and more about till our lands are secure. Marriage in the medieval noble world wasn't about personal happiness. It was about family survival. Your vows were never about love. They were about land, heirs, and legacy. Step outside your castle walls now and look down at the world that actually makes your noble life possible. Because while you're sitting in your hall eating venison and fussing about your tapestry collection, the people who keep you alive are outside in the mud, bent double over fields, coaxing grain from the soil. Without them, your castle would be nothing more than a cold stone box with no food inside. This is the manorial system, the unglamorous engine of medieval Europe. You own the land, and the peasants work it. In return, you provide protection. Protection from what, exactly? Raiders, rival lords, highwaymen, and, if we're being honest, sometimes protection from your own soldiers who might otherwise get bored and start burning things. The whole arrangement works a bit like paying the mafia for security. Hand over your rent, your crops, your labor, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be spared disaster. The peasants' obligations come in many delightful forms. There's rent in coin if they can scrape it together. There are dues in kind, chickens, grain, wool, brought dutifully to your storehouses. And then there's labor service, the most dreaded of all. Imagine being told to leave your own plot of land untended so you can spend several days plowing your lord's fields for free. If your family starves because your crops fail while you're busy on the manor's land, well, that's just bad luck. The system doesn't bend for sentiment. In theory, this is a mutually beneficial contract. They provide labor, you provide protection. In reality, it's lopsided at best. You eat white bread, they eat rye. You drink imported wine, they drink weak ale. You decorate your walls with hunting tapestries. They decorate theirs with soot from the fire pit that smokes up their one-room cottage. But technically, everyone knows their place, and the social pyramid remains intact. And here's where it gets even better. You and your peasants don't even speak the same language, literally. After 1066, English nobility spoke French, and official documents were written in Latin. The peasants, meanwhile, spoke English in its old, tangled form. So when you ride out across your estate, shouting instructions in French, there's a decent chance your tenants stare at you blankly, mutter something under their breath, and carry on plowing. Nothing says togetherness like your landlord literally speaking a different language. This linguistic wall wasn't just inconvenient. It symbolized the gulf between classes. Nobles lived in a world of courts, charters, and crusades. Peasants lived in a world of mud, harvests, and survival. The concerns of one group barely overlapped with the other, except when it came to taxes and obligations. And yet, you rely on them completely. Without their grain, your tables are empty. Without their rents, your hall is cold and silent. Without their obedience, your title is worthless. You may think of them as your peasants, but in truth, you are just as dependent on them as they are on you. The difference is that you have stone walls and armed men, and they don't. Still, it's not all cruelty. Some lords genuinely did protect their peasants, distributing grain in hard times or defending their villages against raiders. A benevolent noble could earn loyalty and even affection, but others squeezed their tenants for every last egg, every last loaf, every last coin. And when resentment boiled over, it was rarely pretty. Revolts, though rare, were terrifying. Armed with pitchforks and axes, peasants could and did rise up, and nobles were often stunned at the sheer anger simmering beneath the surface. But most of the time, things didn't reach that point. Daily life between nobles and peasants was less about open rebellion and more about weary resignation. They worked the fields, paid their dues, and muttered complaints in a language you couldn't understand. You, in turn, maintained your castle, held your courts, and reminded them who was in charge whenever they got too bold. It was an unequal relationship, but it was stable. Picture the rhythm of this relationship. On market day, peasants trudge up the muddy road toward your hall, carrying sacks of grain or baskets of chickens. They bow their heads, hand over their dues, and hope your steward isn't feeling particularly cruel. You glance down from the high seat, nod once, and sip your wine. Business concluded. Then they shuffle back to their huts, where the fire smokes, the roof leaks, and survival is the only goal. And yet, in this exhausting grind, there's a strange balance. Nobles provide the illusion of order. Peasants provide the reality of food. Each needs the other, even if neither particularly likes it. Of course, you never forget the gulf that separates you. You ride past in armor. They kneel in the mud. You feast in your hall. They scrape together pottage from whatever vegetables survived the frost. You sign documents in Latin. They can't write their own names. And still, somehow, this fragile system carries on century after century. So here's the blunt truth. Your nobility rests not on the grandeur of your castle or the brilliance of your lineage, but on the hunched backs of peasants who will never know your language, never eat at your table, and never be remembered in the chronicles. You live, quite literally, because they work. And tomorrow morning, when you walk the fields and see them bent double in the dirt, you'll nod with practiced authority and pretend that this arrangement is perfectly fair, because in the medieval world, fairness doesn't matter. The system does. You've judged peasants, collected rents, and endured another long morning of estate business. Surely now, at last, you get to relax. And yes, you do. But relaxation, if you're a medieval noble, isn't about lying on cushions or dozing through a lazy afternoon. It's about expensive hobbies, dangerous sports, and extravagant displays of wealth, all carefully designed to remind everyone that you are powerful, cultured, and far above the mud-streaked lives of those who serve you. The forest is your playground. Hunting is not just recreation, it's a declaration of rank. Forest laws ensure that deer, boar, and game belong to nobles alone. A peasant caught poaching might be fined, mutilated, or even executed, but you ride out in velvet and leather, a spear in hand, surrounded by hounds and retainers. The peasants who watch you thunder past know that the stag you're chasing could have kept their families alive for a month, but instead it will be carved onto your table to showcase your skill. To you, hunting is sport. To them, it is another reminder that your leisure comes at their expense. If chasing deer grows tedious, you might try hawking instead. A falcon perches on your gloved hand, hooded until the moment you release it to swoop and seize a rabbit or bird. The type of hawk you own even signals your rank, because yes, in this world, even your hobbies are regulated by status. If forests and falcons aren't thrilling enough, there are tournaments, the ultimate stage for noble entertainment. Imagine a broad field outside the castle, crowded with banners and pavilions. Trumpets blare. Knights lower their lances and charge at one another with enough force to splinter wood and sometimes bone. The crowd roars as armor clashes and men crash to the ground. It is violent, chaotic, and very popular. For the knights who compete, tournaments are a chance to prove themselves, to win renown, perhaps even prize money. For everyone else, it's theater. Nobles strutting their courage, ladies watching nervously from the stands, merchants selling food and trinkets at the edges. Medieval Netflix, watching armored men beat each other until someone fell off a horse. The joust is the centerpiece, but melees, mock battles fought in teams, are equally dangerous and equally adored. Knights smash into one another across open fields, leaving broken lances and battered bodies in their wake. To the spectators, it is all exhilarating. To the knights, it is an expensive way to risk life and limb. Yet the tournaments go on, because they are as much about prestige and spectacle as they are about training. They are where alliances are negotiated, marriages arranged, and reputations forged in both victory and defeat. Not all entertainment is bloody. Inside your great hall, there are feasts, not just meals, but pageants of food and sound. Long tables groan under the weight of roasted venison, spiced stews, and honeyed cakes. Servants carry in dishes designed to impress as much as nourish. Pies that release live birds when cut, swans roasted and redressed in their feathers, gilded with gold leaf so they sparkle in the firelight. Eating here is never just about filling stomachs. It is about putting on a performance that reinforces your wealth and power. Between courses, the music begins. Minstrels pluck lutes and harps, fiddlers saw away at strings, and singers tell tales of saints, kings, and epic battles. Jesters crack jokes that skirt the edge of insult, while acrobats tumble across the hall floor. Laughter, applause, and the clatter of goblets mingle into a noise that is half merriment, half declaration of superiority. And when the feast quiets, nobles turn to games. Chess is a favorite, the perfect pastime for a class obsessed with hierarchy and strategy. Each piece mirrors the world outside. Kings, queens, bishops, knights, castles, and pawns, all locked into strict roles on the board. To play is to rehearse the politics of your life in miniature. Dice games are equally popular, though the church frowns on them as dangerously close to gambling. Naturally, that only makes them more appealing. Nobles wager sums that would make a peasant weep, because what's leisure without risk? Noble women, too, have their recreations. Embroidery is both work and pastime, a chance to create tapestries that brighten stone walls while providing an outlet for artistry and storytelling. Sitting together with needles in hand, they stitch, gossip, and shape the very fabric of noble culture. What's striking about all of this is that leisure is never truly private. It is performance. Hunting shows you have land and time to waste. Hawking shows you have the resources to train birds of prey. Tournaments prove your courage, or at least your willingness to be knocked off a horse for honor. Feasts display wealth with every gilded dish, music, and dance. Even embroidery demonstrates the refinement and discipline of noble women. Leisure is not an escape from duty. It is an extension of it, wrapped in silk and spectacle. And always, there is contrast. While you are playing chess in your hall or releasing a falcon into the sky, peasants are stooped in the mud, grinding through the endless labor that funds your amusements. They don't have leisure, they have survival. But that is the point. Your free time, your entertainment, your ability to sit at a feast or watch a tournament is what marks you as different. Leisure is proof of privilege, a visible, audible, edible declaration of superiority. So you end your day not with quiet, but with performance. Perhaps you ride out into the forest to prove your skill, or sit at the tournament field to watch others risk themselves for glory. Perhaps you dine in your hall, feasting while musicians play and servants refill your goblet. Or perhaps you lean over a chessboard, plotting moves in miniature while someone across the board plots against you in real life. Whatever form it takes, your leisure is not an escape from the burdens of nobility. It is nobility. And for a moment, as laughter fills the hall or a knight topples from his horse, you forget about rents, disputes, and obligations. For a moment, you believe in the spectacle. This is your entertainment, dangerous, extravagant, and always a performance. Nobility never rests, even at play. And if you don't subscribe, well, peasants had no leisure either. At least you have a button. Press it or fade into history with them. The castle has grown quiet for the evening. Fires burn in the hearths. Servants rush in hushed flurries of activity, and the great hall fills with the clatter of benches being dragged into place. Tonight is no ordinary supper. Tonight is a feast, the kind of event where the food is less about nourishment and more about making a statement. For peasants, a meal is survival. For you, a noble, it's theater staged on wooden tables, with every course a performance designed to astonish. You stride into the hall, and at once the spectacle begins. Long trestle tables stretch down the length of the chamber, the walls glowing in firelight and shimmering beneath painted plaster and heavy tapestries. The seating is not casual. Everyone knows exactly where they belong, and God help anyone who forgets it. The highest ranks, yourself, your family, and your most distinguished guests, sit at the top table on the raised dais. From here, you can look down the length of the hall and see your importance reflected in the hierarchy of where others are placed. Allies are seated close, rivals pushed a little farther away, minor tenants banished to the end where the food arrives cold and the wine runs thin. Seating is politics turned into furniture. And then comes the food, though calling it food feels like an insult. This is spectacle in edible form. Servants parade in with dishes that defy logic and good taste, but certainly impress the eye. A pie is set down before you, and when the crust is broken, live birds explode out, wings beating frantically, filling the hall with squawks and feathers. Children shriek with delight, courtiers gasp in admiration, and servants scurry to keep the chaos from ruining the tablecloth. The dish itself is barely edible, but that's beside the point. Imagine impressing your guests by serving a pie that explodes birds. 5 stars would host again. Next arrives a swan, roasted, then carefully redressed in its feathers, its beak painted gold so it gleams in the candlelight. It is carried in like a prize trophy, the hall murmuring with awe. Does it taste good? Not particularly. Swans are tough and stringy, but no one cares. This is about theater, not flavor. The nobility of the dish lies not in how it fills your stomach, but in how it dazzles your eyes. Course after course marches in. Venison spiced with pepper imported from the far side of the world, delicate pastries stuffed with almond paste, whole boars presented with apples clenched in their jaws. The sheer expense of it all is staggering. Every pinch of saffron, every handful of cinnamon, every carved sugar sculpture screams wealth. Your guests may leave hungry. After all, much of the food is meant to be admired rather than eaten. But they will leave impressed, and that is what matters. As goblets are filled with wine, the hall grows louder. Wine is a marker of status here. The peasants drink ale because they must. You drink wine because you can. It flows red into polished goblets, warming conversations and loosening tongues. And those conversations matter more than the food itself. Politics is the true main course of any feast. Alliances are whispered over trenchers of bread. Marriages negotiated between sips of spiced claret. Promises sealed with the passing of a dish. To the casual observer, it is merriment. To the noble eye, it is negotiation with cutlery. Entertainment fills the spaces between courses. Minstrels play the lute, their melodies weaving through the smoke of candles and torches. Singers perform tales of heroes and saints, their voices carrying over the clatter of trenchers being cleared. Jugglers toss knives dangerously close to the heads of nervous squires. Jesters tell jokes that make half the hall laugh and the other half bristle. The feast is not just a meal. It is a symphony of sound, sight, taste, and politics. You lean back in your high-backed chair and survey the scene. From this perch, you see more than food. You see the map of your world spread across wooden tables. That knight who owes you service? He sits 3 places down, staring nervously at his wine. The family whose land borders yours? They sit at the edge of the dais, close enough to flatter, far enough to remind them of their place. Every laugh, every toast, every morsel eaten or left uneaten is a gesture, a sign, a move in a delicate game that stretches across years. Feasts are expensive, ruinously so. The kitchens must work for days, sometimes weeks to prepare. Entire herds are slaughtered, storerooms emptied, spices measured out like jewels. And yet nobles host them again and again, because the expense is worth the display. To refuse to throw feasts is to invite whispers of poverty, weakness, or worse, irrelevance. In a world where power is fragile, nothing reassures allies and intimidates rivals quite like a table groaning with food no one actually needs. The peasants, of course, glimpse none of this. They may hear rumors of the swans and gilded pastries, but for them, supper is the same gray pottage it always is. The contrast is deliberate. Your feast is not just for you and your guests. It is also a statement to the world outside your walls, that you can afford excess, that you can waste food for spectacle while others starve. It is cruel, perhaps, but in medieval politics, cruelty often doubled as strength. By the time the last course is cleared and the final goblet drained, the feast has achieved its purpose. Your guests leave full of impressions, if not full of food. They have seen your wealth, your power, your ability to command abundance. They have shared laughter, songs, and perhaps a secret deal whispered between bites. They return to their homes with feathers in their hair, wine in their bellies, and the clear reminder that your household is one worth respecting, fearing, and remembering. So as the torches sputter low and the hall empties of chatter, remember what this really was. Not a dinner, not even a celebration, but a stage play performed in meat and spice, a negotiation held across trenchers of bread, a declaration shouted in roasted swans and exploding pies. This is the spectacle of noble feasting, more theater than sustenance, more politics than pleasure. And if your guests are dazzled, your rivals unnerved, and your peasants reminded of their place, then the evening has been a success. And tomorrow, of course, you'll do it all again. Your castle stands proud on the horizon. Your hall is filled with venison, your cellars with wine, your stables with sleek hunting hounds. You are wealthy, powerful, untouchable, or so it seems. Because here's the truth about medieval nobility. Beneath the velvet cloaks and the gilded feasts, your life is one long gamble. Your wealth comes, of course, from land, acres of it, parceled into manors, forests, and villages. The peasants who till your soil are the foundation of your fortune. Every grain harvested, every sheep sheared, every chicken raised eventually flows into your coffers. And it's not just fields. Toll roads and bridges add a little more to your purse. Hunting parks are not only for sport, but for revenue, stocked with deer that peasants dare not touch. Everything, from a rabbit caught in your woods to a cart creaking down your road, reminds people that this is your land, and they must pay for the privilege of using it. And yet, even with all that, your grip on wealth is precarious. War lurks around every corner. One summons from the king, and you are marching off with knights and men-at-arms, spending your fortune outfitting them, risking your life in battle. A single unlucky arrow could end not only you, but your entire family line. And even if you return alive, the expense of maintaining soldiers, horses, and weapons could leave your finances in ruins. Nobility means wealth, yes, but it also means obligations that bleed you dry. Then there is plague. You conceal yourself in a castle, light fires in every room, scatter herbs on the floor to ward off bad air, and pray until your knees ache, and still the Black Death will find you. In the mid-14th century, it swept across Europe like a shadow with teeth. Nobles died in their halls just as peasants died in their huts. Servants collapsed in kitchens. Knights in armor rotted in their beds. Turns out no amount of venison or wine can stop the plague. Childbirth, too, was a danger. For noble women, pregnancy was a constant risk, each labor an ordeal with no guarantee of survival. For noblemen, every heir was precious, every lack of one a crisis. Bloodlines could vanish in a generation, erased not by war, but by the silent dangers of disease, miscarriage, or early death. A family that spent centuries building castles and amassing estates could see it all end because fate refused them a living son. Even if you escaped plague and war, politics was always waiting with sharpened teeth. One wrong alliance, one poorly timed rebellion, one whisper of treason in the wrong ear, and your lands could be seized, your castle pulled apart stone by stone, your head displayed on a city gate as a warning to others. Nobility gave privilege, but it also painted a target on your back. Kings loved loyal lords, but they loved confiscating estates from traitors even more. And then came the revolts. For centuries, peasants had carried the weight of noble wealth, bowing their heads, handing over rents, and trudging into fields they would never own. But when plague decimated the population, suddenly labor was scarce. Peasants realized their value, and many demanded better terms. Some walked off the land altogether, forcing nobles to scramble for workers. Others revolted outright. In 1381 in England, the peasants' revolt sent mobs storming through London, killing officials and shaking the nobility to its core. For the first time, nobles saw the system crack beneath their feet. The cracks widened as the centuries rolled on. Monarchs grew stronger, centralizing power in their own hands. The Tudors in England, for instance, clipped the wings of overmighty nobles who had once rivaled kings. Castles that once stood as symbols of independence were pulled down or left to crumble. Nobles who had once ruled like mini-kings found themselves reduced to courtiers, dancing attendants in royal palaces, bowing and scraping for favor. And if kings weren't enough, merchants arrived to twist the knife. The rise of trade and towns meant that wealth was no longer limited to land. A merchant in London or Florence could grow richer than a baron, without inheriting a single acre. Money changed the game. Land was still power, yes, but coin, fluid, mobile, untethered, began to rival it. Suddenly, noble privilege didn't look quite so eternal. Imagine the humiliation. Your ancestors fought at Hastings, bled on crusades, built castles that scarred the skyline. And now, in the new world taking shape, some merchant's son with a warehouse of wool can buy more influence than your noble title brings. You still sit at the high table, yes, but the world is shifting beneath you. So here you are, in your hall, sipping wine and listening to minstrels sing of noble glories. Outside, the world changes. Plague hollows out villages. Peasants rise in revolt. Kings tighten their grip. Merchants count their coins. And though you are still wealthy, still privileged, you know, even if you never say it aloud, that nobility is not eternal. Your tapestries may gleam, your feasts may dazzle, your forests may whisper with deer and falcons, but none of it can hold back the tide. Nobility rises, but it also declines. Castles fall silent. Names once feared slip into dust. And one day, someone may look at your family crest, your crumbling manor, and ask, who were they? That is the irony of noble life. You spent every waking moment proving your superiority, and yet in the end, time itself proved stronger. So here we are, at the end of our long march through the world of medieval nobility. It was a life of paradoxes, wasn't it? Immense privilege, but constant risk. Wealth drawn from peasants, tolls, and forests. And yet, a single bad harvest, a single rumor of treason, or a single outbreak of plague could undo it all. Castles stood tall as monuments to dominance, but inside their drafty walls, nobles lived with insecurity pressing at every door. You've walked their chambers, tasted their feasts, watched their jousts, and heard the murmurs of alliances sealed at banquet tables. And yet for all the gilded display, nobility was fragile, untouchable, until it wasn't. Still, their echoes linger. In the laws we follow, in the language we speak, in the ruins that dot the hillsides. Nobility may have crumbled, but their shadows still stretch over us in ways we barely notice. So, next time you're annoyed at paying rent, remember, at least your landlord doesn't own a private army. Probably. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free, anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and pinned comment. For now, let it all fade. The nobles are gone. Their castles are husks, their names little more than whispers. But you are here, and your bed is warm. Your body is heavy now. Your eyelids grow heavy too. The feasts, the hunts, the judgments, they all dissolve into silence. The nobles are gone, but your bed is warm. Let it all fade. Let it all fade. And one last thought before you drift away. Those nobles built castles to carve their names into history. You don't need stone walls. You just need a finger to press a small red button under this video. Subscribe, and you don't just support me. You make sure these stories continue. Don't vanish like a forgotten peasant. Leave your mark. Good night.